Hello and welcome to the 5 Writers 5 Minutes podcast, in which 5 authors share their top writing tips. I'm Lian Tanner.
I'm Sarah Armstrong.
I'm Tristan Bancks.
I'm Deborah Abela.
And I'm Zanni Louise.
Today we're talking about something that is a really simple trick, but it can make a huge difference to your writing, and that is reading your story aloud. And I don't mean reading it to somebody else, although I do sometimes read my stories to imaginary people. I mean reading it aloud to yourself. Sarah, do you read your work aloud? Is that part of your process?
Not really, not like you guys use it. I know you all read aloud, or at least that's what I think you do, as a kind of final editing trick. I read my dialogue aloud as I'm writing it. I'll just actually speak to myself as I'm working. And I think I will start reading aloud, because the few instances where I've done it, well, look, let's be honest, sometimes I will be reading my published book to a group of kids in a school, and I'm reading it and I think, hang on, that I don't like that word there. I want to remove that word, but of course I can't, because the book is published. So perhaps it would have been good if I had read that one aloud before it was published. So I see the sense of it. There's sometimes you can learn so much more when you're hearing it aloud. It's like your ears are coming into play as well. It's not just all happening inside my brain box. So I think I will do it more. What I do find, though, is that I will tell my story to someone else. Like, I'll be trying to nut out a problem and I'll be speaking, oh, this happens, then that happens. And there's something about that, hearing myself describe the story, I'm just sort of broad brush describing it, helps me move the story forward. I know that's a little bit different to what you're describing, but I find it really helpful to tell about my story to someone else, and that really pushes me forward. Something else about the speaking it aloud and the hearing it. Yeah. It's a bit curious how it works. I don't know how it works. What about you?
You're very good at it, Sarah, too. I think when I hear you telling those stories aloud in that way, maybe because you're a journalist and you had to stand up very quickly and in a very articulate way, get a story together. I think I've heard Walt Disney used to do that too. He'd have an idea and mention it to his, secretary or his assistant or his producer or his whoever editor, and, just see if they'd lean in or if they'd kind of, nod but not really get it. I do it with kids as well. I'll mention, I have this idea for a story, but I'm a big cafe mutterer. Like, I realize that I'm sitting there, and I'll only realize it later that I've been sitting there going, and I'll look up, and then somebody will look at, and I'll go, oh, and I'll realize that I have to leave the cafe. So I'm a big cafe mutterer, and I realize when I go to read the audiobook, like to record the audiobook of my books, I'll realize that it sort of comes naturally, and it's because I've been muttering the story to myself hundreds of times as I've been writing it. I've already read the audiobook before all these times. I also got from Wendy Orr, is Nim's Island author. She actually records her entire manuscript once she's kind of done, and I started doing that a few years ago, hearing from her. Wow. And then you'd record the whole thing yourself on a voice memo. You listen to it back, and as you're listening to it back, you're jotting notes, going, "Oh, that's weird. That doesn't make sense. Oh, wouldn't it be? I'm a bit on the nose there." And so that helped. And I've heard of a screenwriter, Ivan Sen, as well, that I've worked with a couple of times, who's a filmmaker. And he used to read his entire script and then listen to it back while he was out shooting something at night as he went to sleep. And he would feel like this reading the script would be in his DNA, in his bones, because he knew it so well. So anyway, I use it in lots of different ways. And I love the read aloud option. Who's next?
I have to say, I love that idea that Wendy had of recording it and listening to it back, because I do read out loud, maybe not the first couple of drafts, because it is a mess. And I think, like we've all said a couple of times, at the first draft, so you're just kind of mucking in, you're literally walking through a muddy kind of field and trying to find the good bits. And then that eventually will become, hopefully, your lovely piece. So as I do go on, I do read it aloud. And so I think it's super important for me, because if I read a paragraph and I trip over a word and I start again and I trip over a word again, there's something not right with that sentence. The rhythm, the mechanics of that sentence, maybe the two letters of the end of the word and the beginning of the word not shutting up well enough. So just literally reading your work out loud. I know if I trip over it, I need to work on that sentence. And so that lets me know that, okay, that sentence is not quite right yet. And, you know, you want your writing to tell your readers something, but you want it to have a rhythm. You want it to have a flow, because the last thing you want is for someone to read your story, trip over it, even in their head, right? And then that takes them out of the story. Anything that takes your readers out of your story and makes them concentrate on the actual physical book and the words on the page, that's not a good thing. So I absolutely recommend reading your stuff out loud to your dog, to your cat, to your brother and sister, or to yourself, whatever. It's really useful.
I had the same issue as you, Sarah. I was reading one of my chapters out of my novel to a class, and I have to edit out all these words as I'm reading. I was like, oh, I really wish I'd read this aloud. So now I read everything aloud, definitely, because I started writing with picture books. And so with picture books, one of the fundamentals is that you read it aloud, because of course they're meant to be read aloud, but it's absolutely true for novels as well. And with all of your work that I'm reading week to week or month to month, I find it very easy to read. And I assume partly that is because you are reading it aloud, because it does just flow so much better. So it's pretty much, my process is like, I'll write the story, work on it, work on the edits, and then I'll do my read aloud version. And that's like the slowest edit, because it takes longer inevitably to read it aloud. I think it takes me about 2 to 3 full working days approximately. And what's that?
Do you record it when you read it?
No. I've done the recording thing like Wendy suggested in the past as well, but no, this is just sort of for my own sake, because I'm often rewriting it as I'm reading it aloud, because it will reveal glitches in the story, but definitely with the words and the choice of words. And I think I have a tendency to overwrite when I'm writing my drafts and just be a little bit too flowery, a bit too clever or whatever. And none of that will get past you if you're reading it aloud, because as soon as you read it aloud, you're like, no, that sounds a bit stupid, really. Let's pull it back. So that's definitely a huge part of what I do. What about you, Lian? You must read yours aloud, because your work is so readable, and I read it aloud to my kids.
I read my work aloud all the time. Reading aloud is really central to my writing process. I lost my voice recently. I lost my voice for 2 whole weeks, and I could not read my work aloud, and it drove me crazy. I find that I can't get a real sense of whether or not a story is working unless I read it aloud. So the first thing I read for is sense. So something that can look quite reasonable when I read it silently. When I read it aloud, I realize that I've missed something out, or I've passed over something too quickly, or it just plain doesn't make sense. So that's the first thing. But like Deb, I also listen for rhythm. And I ask myself questions like, have I got too many short sentences close together? Or have I started a whole lot of sentences with the same word and I didn't notice until I read it aloud, and that word keeps cropping up? Does a sentence sound clunky? Does the dialogue sound like the way real people talk, or does it just sound too formal and as if it's been written but not spoken? And sometimes I do pretend that I'm talking to a group of people or to a class of kids, and I watch for the places where they get bored or where they lose interest. And even though they're not really there, I can pick those places. So that's really helpful. So next time you finish a story, go back and read it aloud to yourself. Listen for the things we've talked about, because we all do it slightly differently, and then rewrite the story to make it better. This is 5 Writers, 5 Minutes. We're a podcast, we're a YouTube channel. Go and have a look at the rest of what we do. See you later.
See you guys.